For the Johnson family, December was never just another month. In their quiet suburban neighborhood, where rows of manicured lawns stood like silent soldiers, they were determined to bring something different, something alive. The Johnsons were one of the few black families in the community, and though most days passed without confrontation, there was always a sense that they stood out. They felt it in the way certain neighbors watched them longer than necessary, the way meetings lingered on rules no one else seemed to follow until they did. So when the first cool breath of December arrived, Marcus Johnson climbed onto his roof with a determination that carried more than just holiday cheer. To him, the lights meant resilience. They meant joy against a backdrop of silence. What started as a few strands of white lights along the roofline quickly grew into something bigger, an entire design that seemed to dance with life. Each day, more decorations appeared. A glowing reindeer grazed in the yard, followed by a towering inflatable Santa who waved with exaggerated cheer. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with just the basics. He envisioned something that could make people stop in their tracks. Soon, strings of multicolored bulbs crisscrossed the yard like veins of light, and a star the size of a dining table gleamed from the highest peak of the roof. By the second week of December, the Johnson home was no longer a house but a spectacle. The lights pulsed in sync with music, carefully programmed so that each beat of a holiday song sent colors rippling across the front yard. Neighbors slowed their cars to watch, children pointed with wide-eyed excitement, and people who had never spoken to the Johnsons suddenly found themselves gathered at the edge of the driveway, smiling and clapping as though they had stumbled into a private concert. But with every cheer came a frown. From across the street, members of the Homeowners Association took notice. The HOA board president, a woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, was the first to mutter that the display was excessive. Soon, whispers spread, too bright, too loud, too disruptive. The same neighbors who had once applauded quietly retreated, afraid to be seen siding with the family the HOA was already circling. The first letter arrived folded neatly in the mailbox. It cited rules about exterior uniformity and community decorum. The Johnsons were told their lights were not in keeping with the standards of the neighborhood. To Marcus, the words dripped with more than regulation. They carried the weight of judgment. He tucked the letter away but did not turn off the lights. If anything, he added more. As the days rolled forward, something remarkable began to happen. Word spread beyond the neighborhood. A photo posted online by a passing teenager went viral overnight. Soon, families from other towns drove in, eager to see the house that glowed like a carnival. Local news reporters showed up, pointing cameras at the home as though it were a landmark. Cars lined the streets, engines idling, headlights adding to the glow. For every neighbor who grumbled about traffic, there were 10 strangers who smiled and waved, grateful to witness the holiday magic. The Johnson children, Jamal and Kayla, felt like they were living in a fairy tale. Each night, they stood in the yard, wrapped in scarves, listening to strangers cheer for their father's masterpiece. To them, it was more than fun. It was proof that their family could be a source of light in a place that often felt dim. But as the visitors grew, so did the tension. The HOA convened an emergency meeting, papers shuffled, and threats were drafted. More letters followed, each one colder than the last. They demanded that the Johnsons shut down the display immediately or face mounting fines. But Marcus, fueled by a mix of pride and defiance, refused. He knew what the lights meant, not just to his family but to the growing crowd of people who looked at their home as a beacon during a season meant for joy. By mid-December, the street had transformed into something the HOA had never planned for. Food trucks parked at the curb, capitalizing on the stream of visitors. Small vendors appeared with hot chocolate, candy canes, and handmade crafts. It was as though the Johnson home had birthed a winter festival, one that brought warmth and noise into a community built on quiet control. The HOA seethed. They called it chaos, a disturbance, even a threat to property values. Yet, no matter how many fines they stacked, the lights stayed on. Each night they blazed brighter, the music louder, the crowds bigger. The Johnsons were no longer just hosting a holiday display, they were at the center of a battle between tradition and authority, individuality and conformity, light and shadow. The night before Christmas Eve, something shifted. News vans lined the street, their cables snaking across lawns. Influencers posed in front of the glowing house, their followers boosting the spectacle further. Strangers brought gifts for the Johnson children, thanking the family for bringing holiday cheer in a year that had felt heavy for so many. But behind the laughter and the joy lingered a storm. The HOA was preparing its biggest move yet, one that would push this conflict to the breaking point. And though the Johnsons had no idea what was coming, the glow of their lights was already too bright to ignore, too powerful to snuff out. What had started as a family's tradition had become a stage, and the entire neighborhood, perhaps even the entire town, was watching. The spark had been lit. The battle had only just begun. By the morning after Christmas Eve's chaos, the Johnsons' home had become something far greater than a holiday display. It was a landmark. The street outside, once a sleepy stretch of asphalt lined with identical driveways, now resembled a festival ground. Even in daylight with the lights turned off, people gathered to take photos in front of the towering decorations. Children ran up and down the sidewalks, their mittened hands clutching candy canes from the vendors who had staked their claim on the spectacle. For the Johnsons, it felt surreal. But for the Homeowners Association, it was nothing short of a nightmare. In the board's eyes, their carefully maintained rules had been trampled under the weight of neon lights and noisy visitors. The HOA's identity, its very control, was slipping, and the board members were determined to strike back with force. The first sign of their retaliation came in the form of a bright orange paper taped to the Johnsons' front door. It was an official notice declaring the holiday display in violation of multiple community standards, threatening escalating fines that would grow by the day. They listed noise ordinances, traffic concerns, and even claimed that the excessive lighting posed a safety hazard to passing drivers. Each word was crafted to make the family feel cornered. Marcus Johnson stared at the paper longer than he should have, the weight of it pressing down on him. Yet, that evening as the sun disappeared and the first stars emerged, he plugged in the lights again. And as if the universe conspired in his favor, the crowd returned, larger, louder, hungrier for the magic that the Johnsons' home had come to represent. The HOA responded swiftly. Calls were placed to the police, though officers who arrived found no legal grounds to intervene. The city itself had no ordinance against holiday decorations, and the traffic, while inconvenient, was not unlawful. Each attempt to shut the Johnsons down fizzled, leaving the HOA more frustrated and desperate. Still, their letters grew harsher, their threats heavier. As the days passed, what had once been a neighborhood conflict transformed into something bigger. Local television stations covered the drama nightly, their headlines pitched with sensational flair, "Holiday lights divide suburban community." Reporters stood outside the glowing home, cameras capturing the contrast between the joy of visitors and the scowls of HOA members standing in the shadows. Soon, the story broke into national news. Online influencers latched onto it, streaming live from the street. Hashtags spread across social media. Hashtag lights versus hashtag Johnson Christmas, hashtag let them shine. The Johnsons' display had become a symbol, not just of holiday cheer but of defiance against rigid control. The family, whether they wanted it or not, had become the face of a cultural debate. But not all the attention was joyous. Alongside the cheering crowds came critics. Anonymous emails poured in, warning the Johnsons that they were destroying the neighborhood. Online forums debated whether they were selfish, chasing clout at the expense of their neighbors. Some residents who had once clapped quietly at the lights now avoided eye contact altogether, fearful of picking sides. Despite the tension, the display continued to grow. Donations arrived from strangers who wanted to support the Johnsons in paying off the mounting fines. Local businesses offered sponsorships, eager to link their names with the viral spectacle. What the HOA had called a violation had transformed into an economy. Every night, food trucks lined up, children posed for photos, and the Johnsons' home shone as the epicenter of holiday wonder. But inside the HOA's boardroom, frustration boiled. They were losing control, their authority mocked by every viral post, every cheering visitor. The board president convened an emergency session, her voice sharp with anger. To her, the Johnsons weren't just breaking rules, They were dismantling the very order of the neighborhood. Something drastic had to be done. The plan was swift and bold. On the morning of December 26th, HOA representatives filed a lawsuit against the Johnson family, demanding an immediate injunction to remove the lights and decorations. They framed it not as a matter of holiday cheer but as a breach of contract, a violation of the agreements each homeowner had signed. To them, this wasn't about joy, it was about power. News of the lawsuit spread just as quickly as the story itself. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, microphones thrust forward as cameras captured every detail. Legal experts weighed in, some predicting the Johnsons would be forced to comply, others pointing out that freedom of expression might protect them. The spectacle had moved from the street to the legal system, and the stakes had never been higher. Yet, on the ground, the lights blazed as bright as ever. Marcus refused to unplug them, and the visitors kept coming. On December 27th, the crowd was so large that police were forced to direct traffic. Helicopters flew overhead, broadcasting live footage of the glowing house. It was no longer just a neighborhood battle, it was a cultural flashpoint, a story of defiance that resonated far beyond the quiet streets of the HOA. The Johnson children, who once saw the lights as simple fun, began to feel the weight of what their family had started. Jamal noticed the way strangers spoke their names as though they were characters in a story. Kayla saw how her classmates looked at her differently, some with admiration, others with envy or disdain. What had begun as a family tradition had become a responsibility, one they were too young to fully understand. But Marcus knew. He felt it each time he looked at the growing pile of HOA letters, each time he saw the scowling faces of his neighbors. Yet he also felt it in the warmth of strangers who hugged him, thanking him for bringing joy to their lives. He stood between two forces, the crushing hand of authority and the rising wave of public support. He could no longer step back, no longer dim the lights, no matter how heavy the burden became. As New Year's Eve approached, the display reached its peak. Fireworks burst above the neighborhood as the Johnson home glowed brighter than ever. Thousands tuned into live streams, watching as the lights danced in perfect synchronization to the music of the season. It was a celebration unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. But behind the joy lurked shadows. The lawsuit loomed, and the HOA was not finished. The Johnsons, for all their defiance, knew that the next chapter of their battle would not be fought with lights but with lawyers, rules, and relentless pressure. The holiday season had given them power, but January would test whether that light could survive the cold months ahead. The crackdown had begun. As the new year dawned, the Johnson family found themselves living in two separate realities. By day, the sunlight washed over their quiet home, casting long shadows on the dormant grass and the tired Christmas decorations that still clung stubbornly to the lawn. The HOA's legal threats piled higher with each passing morning, their language colder and more technical, filled with references to bylaws and contractual obligations. In those hours, the Johnsons felt the full weight of what they were up against. Not just neighbors with sour looks, but a well-funded, tightly organized body armed with lawyers and influence. But at night, everything transformed. The house erupted in brilliance once again, and the crowd returned, larger and more spirited with every passing evening. The sound of music and laughter filled the air, mingling with the hum of food trucks and the chatter of live streamers narrating their experiences. The neighborhood became a carnival ground, a stage for something much bigger than holiday cheer. The contrast between those two worlds created a strange tension. On one hand, Marcus and his wife Angela were celebrated as heroes, symbols of joy, defiance, and community spirit. Strangers approached them with tears in their eyes, thanking them for giving families a reason to smile during hard times. Yet, on the other hand, they were vilified, accused of disrupting peace, breaking contracts, and bringing chaos to a neighborhood that once prided itself on order. It wasn't just the HOA that took notice. Local politicians saw opportunity in the conflict, weaving the Johnson story into speeches about freedom and expression. Civil rights activists compared the family's defiance to a broader struggle against institutions that prioritized control over individuality. Even comedians on late-night television made jokes about the Christmas lights so bright they blinded the HOA. What began as a neighborhood squabble had become a national conversation, and the Johnsons' faces were plastered everywhere, from television screens to internet memes. Yet, with that fame came scrutiny. The family's social media accounts were flooded with comments, some supportive, others hostile. Journalists dug into their history, eager to paint a fuller picture of who they were. The Johnson children, Jamal and Kayla, found themselves both admired and mocked at school. Their classmates debated whether their family was cool rebels or attention seekers who ruined the block. The kids bore smiles in public, but at night, when the lights dimmed, their exhaustion showed. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down. Their lawsuit was filed with precision, demanding tens of thousands in damages and an injunction to immediately remove the decorations. They argued not just that the Johnsons had broken rules, but that their defiance had caused measurable harm, lowering property values, endangering residents with traffic congestion, and disrupting the community's image. For the board, this was more than a holiday grievance. It was about preserving authority, ensuring that no single homeowner could ever challenge their control again. As the legal battle inched forward, something unexpected happened. The public rallied to the Johnsons' defense, not just with words, but with money. A crowdfunding campaign sprang up online, raising thousands of dollars within days. Supporters framed it as a fight for freedom, and donations poured in from across the country. The Johnsons, who had once worried about paying the mounting HOA fines, suddenly found themselves with enough financial backing to hire a skilled legal team of their own. The first hearing drew a media circus. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing as the Johnsons entered. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with the weight of something far larger than a simple neighborhood dispute. On one side, the HOA's lawyers spoke with cold precision, painting the Johnsons as reckless rule-breakers who had brought chaos to a quiet community. On the other, the Johnsons' attorney argued passionately about the importance of personal expression, family tradition, and the joy their display had brought to countless strangers. Though the judge refrained from ruling immediately, the spectacle itself became another victory for the Johnsons. Outside the courthouse, supporters cheered, holding signs that read, "Let the lights shine," and "Itcha equals Grinches." Reporters rushed to capture every word, broadcasting the conflict to millions more across the country. But the fight took its toll. Nights that were once filled with pure joy now carried an edge of anxiety. Marcus worried about the stress on his children, Angela fretted about their privacy, and both knew that legal battles could drag on for months, if not years. Yet every evening as the sun fell and the lights clicked on, the crowd roared back to life. For a few hours each night, the worries melted away, replaced by the glow of neon reindeer and glittering stars. The HOA, however, was relentless. They hired private security to monitor the neighborhood, documenting every crowd, every traffic jam, every scrap of litter left behind. They issued new rules banning vendors and food trucks, though enforcement proved difficult with so many outsiders flooding the area. Some residents, weary of the nightly chaos, began openly siding with the HOA, demanding peace and quiet. The once unified neighborhood fractured, split into those who embraced the Johnsons' rebellion and those who longed for order to return. Through it all, Marcus found himself changing. Once, he had simply wanted to make his children smile, to create a memory that would live with them forever. Now, he realized he was at the center of something bigger, something symbolic. People saw his lights as a stand against conformity, a refusal to bow to faceless authority. That realization both empowered him and frightened him. He was no longer just a father hanging decorations, he was a symbol of resistance, whether he wanted to be or not. As January deepened, the crowds thinned somewhat, but the spectacle never faded entirely. The lights, once meant only for Christmas, stayed on well into the new year, becoming a permanent glow against the winter nights. Some called it beautiful, others called it defiance. For the Johnsons, it was survival. The story that began with twinkling bulbs and inflatable snowmen had become a saga of law, power, and community. The Johnsons were no longer fighting to celebrate Christmas. They were fighting for the right to be themselves in a world that demanded uniformity. And as the court battle loomed larger, The question shifted from whether the lights would stay up to whether the Johnsons could withstand the crushing weight of attention, pressure, and conflict that came with them. The fight was far from over. The snow began to melt, leaving behind patches of slush that glistened beneath the Johnsons' ever-glowing lights. What once had been festive decorations in the spirit of Christmas had now transformed into something else entirely, an ongoing beacon of defiance. The glow was no longer simply a cheerful celebration. It had become a constant reminder that this quiet suburban neighborhood was no longer quiet, no longer normal, and no longer in the HOA's full control. As weeks passed, the crowds changed. Families with children still visited, though less frequently as the holiday season slipped further into the past. In their place came a different sort of audience: activists, journalists, influencers chasing content, and even opportunists looking to profit from the spectacle. Vendors pushed carts filled with hot cocoa and glowing trinkets, while pop-up stands sold t-shirts emblazoned with slogans like "Power to the Lights" and "HOA Can't Dim Us." The Johnsons' home, once just another brick house on a quiet cul-de-sac, had become a marketplace, a movement, and a battlefield all at once. The HOA saw these developments as validation of their worst fears. Their arguments about traffic congestion, property value decline, and neighborhood disruption no longer sounded exaggerated, they were now plain realities. Streets overflowed with parked cars, blocking driveways and making emergency vehicle access a nightmare. Noise carried late into the night, amplified by music from food trucks and the chatter of excited visitors. The community that had once been proud of its neat lawns and orderly aesthetics now resembled a carnival ground. Inside the Johnson household, the atmosphere shifted. Angela, once thrilled by the joy the lights brought to strangers, grew weary. The attention felt invasive. Reporters lingered outside, snapping photos at odd hours. Strangers knocked on the door, asking for interviews or selfies. The children, Jamal and Kayla, longed for normal evenings when they could relax without their home being treated as a tourist attraction. Privacy, once taken for granted, had become a luxury they no longer possessed. Marcus carried the weight heavily. His pride in creating something magical had morphed into anxiety. He could not deny the power of what he had started. His family's house had become a symbol of resistance across the country. But with every cheer from supporters came another fine from the HOA, another legal notice, another reminder that the struggle was far from over. He often stood by the window late at night, staring at the endless stream of lights, wondering if he had unleashed something that could never be undone. Meanwhile, the media continued to fan the flames. National outlets covered the story with sensational headlines about the family who fought Christmas wars with their HOA. Talk shows debated whether the Johnsons were modern-day folk heroes or reckless rule breakers. Even late-night comedians added fuel, turning the Johnsons into household names. The attention gave the family a strange sort of power, but it also painted targets on their backs. The HOA board members, too, felt the strain. What had begun as a simple enforcement of community rules had spiraled beyond their control. They were now vilified online, receiving hate mail and threats. Some members resigned, unwilling to endure the public backlash. Others dug in deeper, convinced that if they relented now, the HOA's authority would be permanently weakened. They hired additional lawyers, filed new injunctions, and even attempted to recruit residents to testify against the Johnsons in court. The neighborhood itself fractured more sharply. Some residents openly supported the Johnsons, hosting gatherings and decorating their own lawns in solidarity. Others seethed with frustration, furious that their property values were being jeopardized and their peace disrupted. At homeowner meetings, arguments erupted, voices rose, and once friendly neighbors became enemies. The community spirit that had once united them around block parties and shared traditions was now consumed by bitterness and division. Through it all, the lights never dimmed. They shone each night, a constant presence that no court order or complaint could extinguish. For many outsiders, they were beautiful, an emblem of defiance glowing against the dark winter nights. But for those who lived closest, the constant glare felt oppressive, like a spotlight exposing every fracture in their once private lives. As February crept in, the Johnsons' attorney prepared them for the possibility of escalation. The HOA's lawsuit was moving forward, and the stakes grew higher each day. There was talk of significant financial penalties, forced removal of the decorations, and even the possibility of liens against their property. The family that had once felt like heroes to strangers now felt cornered in their own home. And yet, a new wave of support surged from an unlikely place. Businesses began reaching out, offering sponsorships to keep the lights glowing. Energy companies, decoration manufacturers, and even national brands saw marketing opportunities in aligning with the viral sensation. The Johnsons were offered free lights, upgraded technology, and money to turn their display into something even grander. What had started as a family tradition was morphing into a full-fledged enterprise, one that threatened to cement itself permanently in the neighborhood's identity. The irony was not lost on Marcus. He had begun with a simple desire to bring holiday joy to his children and neighbors. Now, corporations and activists were turning his house into a symbol that stretched far beyond his intentions. Each offer of sponsorship was tempting, promising stability and financial relief, but also pulling the family deeper into the public eye. The Johnsons were no longer just homeowners. They were unwilling celebrities, entangled in a battle between community control and cultural spectacle. At night, when the lights blazed and the crowds cheered, it was easy to forget the strain. The laughter of children, the smiles of strangers, the flash of cameras, it all created an intoxicating sense of purpose. But in the quiet hours after midnight, when the last visitor left and the house fell silent, the questions lingered. How long could this continue? How much more pressure could their family endure? And what would happen when the court's gavel finally came down? The Johnsons had crossed a line of no return. The lights, once a symbol of joy, had become a weapon in a cultural battle that neither side seemed ready to end. What lay ahead was not just a decision about decorations but about power, freedom, and the right to define one's own home. And as the winter deepened, so too did the shadows gathering around their bright, shining house. By March, the snow was gone, but the lights still shone. What had begun as a holiday tradition, then an act of defiance, now lived as a constant presence, a year-round landmark that refused to fade. The Johnson house had become so iconic that people no longer referred to the neighborhood by its official name. Instead, it was called the Christmas Block. To outsiders, it was a novelty. To the HOA, it was a nightmare that had now escalated to its most serious stage, the courtroom. The case against the Johnsons had drawn immense attention. Local hearings that once attracted a handful of neighbors now saw packed galleries filled with reporters, curious residents, and activists eager to witness the showdown. Television vans lined the courthouse steps, broadcasting live updates as if it were a celebrity trial. The Johnsons walked into each session under flashing cameras, their faces appearing on evening news broadcasts across the country. They were no longer just homeowners. They were the central figures in a national debate about individuality, community rules, and freedom within one's own property. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere carried a weight that no decoration or holiday cheer could soften. The HOA's legal team presented thick binders of evidence, photos of crowded streets, reports of traffic violations, testimonies from neighbors claiming sleepless nights due to the glare. They framed the Johnsons' lights not as a joyful expression but as a public nuisance, a violation of agreed-upon standards that protected the community's value. Their argument was sharp, logical, and relentless. If rules meant nothing, then the HOA itself meant nothing. The Johnsons' side, however, leaned into the human element. Their attorney painted them not as reckless rebels, but as a family celebrating culture, community, and creativity. He emphasized the joy the lights brought, the economic boost to local vendors, the charitable donations sparked by visitors, and the national recognition their display had earned. The Johnsons weren't harming the neighborhood, he argued. They were uplifting it, giving it an identity far greater than neatly trimmed lawns ever could. The tension grew with every passing session. Marcus often sat with his hands clenched, struggling to mask the mixture of pride and dread that battled within him. Angela's face, once lit with joy at the spectacle, now carried exhaustion. Their children fidgeted under the constant gaze of cameras, no longer innocent bystanders but unwilling players in a conflict that consumed their daily lives. Back in the neighborhood, the divide sharpened further. Supporters organized rallies outside the courthouse, waving signs that read, "Let the lights shine," and "Freedom starts at home." Opponents gathered just as fiercely, holding banners demanding, "Save our streets," and "No carnival in my backyard." The once tight-knit suburban enclave now resembled two warring camps, each convinced the fate of their community hung in the balance. What unsettled the HOA most was the growing commercialization of the spectacle. Companies continued to align with the Johnsons, sponsoring upgrades that turned their display into something beyond imagination. Drones now danced overhead in synchronized light shows, projecting holiday-themed animations into the night sky. National charities tied fundraising campaigns to the display, drawing even more crowds. Every attempt by the HOA to frame the lights as a nuisance was undercut by the growing sense that the Johnsons had tapped into something bigger than the neighborhood, a cultural phenomenon that stretched across the nation. But behind the scenes, cracks in the Johnson family's resolve began to show. Marcus questioned whether he had gone too far, whether the fight had shifted from principle to pride. Angela, weary from months of scrutiny, longed for quiet evenings without the hum of generators or the chatter of strangers outside their door. Jamal and Kayla missed their privacy, their backyard play overshadowed by cameras and gawkers. The lights had given them fame, but at the cost of normalcy. As the trial dragged on, the judge issued temporary orders limiting certain aspects of the display. Vendors were restricted, traffic measures enforced, and curfews imposed on the nightly shows. But the heart of the matter, the lights themselves, remained unresolved. Each night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the house still ignited in color, refusing to yield even under legal pressure. The spectacle took on a surreal quality. News helicopters captured aerial shots of the house glowing defiantly in the dark, surrounded by the grid of quieter, dimmer homes. Late-night pundits debated whether this was a simple property dispute or a reflection of larger tensions in American life, between individuality and conformity, joy and order, freedom and regulation. The Johnsons were cast as symbols, whether they wanted to be or not. In quieter moments, Marcus reflected on how far they had come. A simple idea to make Christmas brighter for his children had spiraled into a nationwide battle. He thought of his parents and grandparents, who had always valued pride in their home as a form of resistance against the struggles of being black in America. To them, ownership had been power, and self-expression had been a statement of existence in a society that too often sought to silence them. Was he carrying that legacy forward, or twisting it into something his family never intended? Angela worried about their children's futures. Would Jamal and Kayla forever be remembered not as kids but as the Christmas lights kids? Would they carry the weight of their parents' defiance long after the lights finally dimmed? She watched them sleep at night, faces lit faintly by the glow seeping through their curtains, and wondered if they would resent this battle or grow stronger because of it. The chapter of their lives that had begun with laughter and holiday spirit now carried an air of inevitability. The judge's decision would come soon, and whatever the outcome, it would ripple far beyond their own yard. The lights had transformed their lives, their community, and their sense of what home meant. But as the day of judgment drew closer, the Johnsons knew one truth above all. No matter what the gavel declared, nothing would ever return to the way it had been before those first strings of lights were plugged in. The glow that had begun as joy now carried the weight of an entire movement. And soon, the final verdict would determine whether it would continue to shine or be forever dimmed. The courtroom was silent on the morning the verdict was scheduled to be delivered. Months of tension, endless hearings, and constant media coverage had all led to this moment. Reporters crowded the steps of the courthouse, their microphones and cameras pointed like weapons at the front doors, waiting for the Johnson family to emerge. Protesters on both sides stood across the street, their signs swaying in the cold spring wind, their chants clashing in a confusing chorus of anger, hope, and defiance. Inside, the Johnsons sat together, shoulders touching, hands clasped. Marcus's jaw was tight, his eyes locked on the judge's bench as though staring hard enough could sway the decision. Angela's breath came in slow, measured intervals, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped her husband's hand. Jamal and Kayla sat quietly, their young faces etched with the kind of seriousness children should never have to wear. The HOA members sat stiffly in a row, their attorneys lined up in front of them with stacks of papers, their expressions unreadable. When the judge finally entered, the air shifted. The quiet deepened into something heavier, as if even the walls leaned closer to listen. The judge's words were measured, deliberate, as he outlined the competing arguments. The HOA had made its case about rules, order, and community standards. The Johnsons had countered with the value of expression, joy, and the economic benefits that had unexpectedly transformed the neighborhood. Then the decision came. The judge ruled that the HOA had the authority to enforce certain restrictions, traffic flow, noise levels, commercial vendors, but he did not order the Johnsons to remove their lights. The display, he declared, while unconventional, did not violate any explicit written covenant that barred decorations of that scale. The Johnsons were permitted to keep their lights, though under new guidelines designed to address safety and community impact. The reaction was immediate and explosive. In the gallery, Johnson supporters erupted in cheers, their voices echoing off the courtroom's high ceilings. Opponents groaned in frustration, some shaking their heads, others storming out before the proceedings had even concluded. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. Within minutes, social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag let the lights shine, hashtag HOA clash, hashtag Christmas justice. For the Johnsons, relief washed over them, but it was bittersweet. They had won the right to keep the lights, but victory carried a weight they hadn't anticipated. The fight had taken so much peace, privacy, and energy, and though the ruling allowed them to continue, they knew things could never return to what they once were. Back at home that evening, the neighborhood felt different. Supporters gathered at the Johnsons' yard, celebrating as though the verdict itself was a holiday. Strangers brought balloons and homemade signs, children cheered in delight, and the familiar glow of the lights seemed brighter than ever. The Johnson house was no longer just a decorated home. It was a symbol, a landmark, a living piece of resistance that carried meaning far beyond the neighborhood. But beneath the cheers, not everyone was pleased. Across the street, a group of HOA loyalists stood in silence, their faces hard with disapproval. To them, the ruling was not just a loss but a dangerous precedent, a signal that rules could be bent or broken if someone gained enough public sympathy. They feared what might come next. Would the neighborhood become a playground for attention seekers? Would property values suffer? Or had the judge's decision opened the door to chaos? As weeks passed, the Johnsons adjusted to their new reality. The display evolved once more, not just Christmas lights, but year-round installations that shifted with the seasons. In spring, pastel lights shaped like flowers bloomed across the yard. In summer, patriotic reds, whites, and blues washed the house for Independence Day. By fall, orange and gold leaves glowed alongside jack-o'-lantern displays. What had begun as a Christmas spectacle became a rotating celebration of culture and community, drawing crowds no matter the month. The family found ways to balance their newfound fame with their need for peace. They set strict schedules for the shows, coordinated with local law enforcement to manage traffic, and worked with charities to ensure the spectacle served a greater good. Slowly, the chaos began to take shape as something more sustainable. Still, Marcus often sat on his porch in the quiet hours after the lights dimmed, reflecting on what had unfolded. He thought about how the fight had begun with a simple joy for his children, then grown into a battle for principle, and finally become something larger than his family alone. He wondered if, given the choice, he would do it all again. The exhaustion in his bones suggested one answer, but the pride in his chest whispered another. Angela found comfort in the way strangers shared their gratitude. Families told her how the lights brought them hope during hard times, how their children laughed with delight on nights when they otherwise might have sat silently in their rooms. For her, the display was no longer about defiance but about giving something back to the world. The burden was heavy, yes, but the impact was undeniable. Jamal and Kayla grew up with the lights as part of their identity. They learned early the power of visibility, the double-edged nature of attention, and the resilience required to stand firm when the world was watching. Their childhood was far from ordinary, but it was rich with lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the meaning of home. By the time December rolled around again, the neighborhood was no longer the same. Vendors lined the streets in an organized fashion, traffic flowed under police guidance, and the Johnson house had become a permanent stop on holiday tours across the state. Tour buses unloaded visitors who marveled at the sight, their faces lit by the glow of thousands of synchronized lights. The HOA, though bitter, begrudgingly adapted to the new reality. Their authority had been challenged and reshaped, their once absolute control now tempered by the power of community and public opinion. The Johnsons stood together that December night, gazing at their house as it blazed in color, a spectacle that had changed their lives forever. The battle with the HOA was over, but the legacy of the lights would remain, etched into the history of their neighborhood and their family's story. The glow was no longer just about Christmas. It was about resilience, identity, and the unyielding belief that even in the face of rules, regulations, and resistance, joy had a place to shine. And as snowflakes drifted gently down, the Johnsons knew one thing with certainty: their lights would never truly go out. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret, but remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.